I am Melissa with MedTrainer, and I would love to introduce you to Anything But Basic, Getting Evidence Right in Compliance Audit. I would love to introduce Jessica. Jessica, can you tell us about yourself?
Oh, hi there, everyone. Thank you for joining us this afternoon, or who knows, it might even be morning for some of you. I really don't know. But I'm the CEO for Simply Compliance. I've been working in the healthcare compliance and regulatory space for just about 25 years. So I've seen just about everything in the healthcare space, compliance, regulatory, privacy, security, you name it, probably been there. And one of the things that really has intrigued me over the years is how we, all of us, how we respond to an audit request or an investigation. And I'm fascinated by this because in all the years, I've even worked for a regulator, in all the years I've been doing this, I have found very few people, including myself, who can always nail the audit request and really not stress when you get that letter. Congratulations. You're being investigated or audited, or you have an accreditation and someone's coming to assess your compliance with accreditation standards. We all get a little bit nervous, and I'm fascinated by this. And what I wanted to do is I've come to understand and really feel very confident in how I respond to an audit request or an investigator. There is a method to some of that madness. And what I really wanted to do was work with colleagues in the sector to say, well, hold up, there are some strategies you can use to make the whole experience a little less stressful. I'm not going to say enjoyable, because that's probably a little of an overstatement, but certainly less stressful and more successful, so that you come out of the audit hopefully with a lot, generally a better experience. Should I continue on, Melissa?
Yes, please do.
All right, that is the background, and now you know why this subject is so important to me. Here we go. There you go. Thank you. There are some basics. So first of all, I'm going to ask, and you can think about this in the back of your head, how many of you on the call have been in a situation where you had a letter or an email or a phone call and it went along the lines of, hey, congratulations, you are being audited. You've got 5 days, 10 days, 2 days even to respond to this audit request. And literally you're looking at this paper and thinking, there's no way, like I can't, I'm never going to get here. I've done it. I've been there. I understand the whole, for some reason, over Thanksgiving, over Christmas, over New Year's, they seem to be particularly wonderful times to receive these letters. So as if it's not stressful enough, there is that as well. So some questions for you as you think about those experiences of what might make the whole process just, I hesitate to say simpler, but actually it does make the process run more smoothly in the short term and in the long term. So let's go through this. What I tell people and what I tell my teams and what I tell the organizations that I work with is tell the story of your clients. Tell the story. So many of us, when we get that letter or that notification or that phone call, whatever it is, we get so wrapped up in, we're being audited. Oh my goodness, we need to pull together the evidence. And what I have found is that people are so busy trying to pull together evidence and show evidence of compliance, they forget to tell the story of what that evidence is demonstrating. How does it demonstrate compliance? How does it work within your organization? So how do you go about telling the story, right? And some of this, it's going to sound maybe in some ways easier than it really is, but with practice, it really does get a little bit easier. And with some forward planning, the process also gets easier. So I'd say, first of all, you need to appoint a project lead. I've had clients say to me, well, we can just do this thing we call compliance off the side of our desks. No, that's not going to work. You need to appoint somebody who can be responsible for the audit, who can coordinate stakeholders, who can coordinate responses, who can help gather the evidence, and someone who's accountable for leading that project. You need to really understand the scope of the audit or the investigation or the accreditation. And we'll go through that again, but it's really making sure you understand what is being reviewed, what's under investigation. You need to think about developing your own audit criteria and your own data collection tools. So how are you going to collect the evidence for this audit? Do you have some sort of organized method that you're going to collect the information that you need to then present to your auditor or your regulator? Look at your stakeholders. Who's going to need to support you? Who are you going to get information from? Who might need to participate in face-to-face interviews? Establish a central repository for your evidence. So you're gathering all this information. You're gathering, you've got a project plan. You've got someone who's a project lead. You're identifying your audit criteria. You're getting your evidence together. So where are you keeping all this information? Put it in one place. Start labeling the evidence. Figure out a way to identify what evidence is going to go for which pieces of the audit. What are you showing evidence for? I'd say also gather your evidence strategically. Not every document you have in an organization demonstrates compliance with anything. So think about the evidence in advance. Think about what evidence would suggest compliance with whatever criteria you're being measured against, and aim to gather that evidence. Throwing mud at a wall and hoping that something will stick isn't going to work for you. You want to think very carefully about what you're providing. And as you're doing that, as you're gathering this information, think about the risks. Do you see any potential non-compliance? Any particular inconsistencies, and identify those before the auditors do. And that's so that you can actually start to do something with it. Also, be prepared, prep your people. If you're going to have face-to-face interviews, give your folks a little bit of context, do some rehearsals, and we'll talk about all of this a little bit more. And this is all going to help you tell a story about your compliance, and we'll work out how that's going to happen as we go forward in the presentation. So let's get started. We talked about appointing a project, right? And I won't spend too much time on this slide. Whenever you get an audit request, or you know you're being assessed for whatever, you know you're being investigated, appoint someone to lead, be the point person. They'll coordinate everyone who needs to be involved. They can produce a project plan. You treat the audit request as a project. What's going to happen? What are the milestones? Who needs to do what? And your project lead is going to be controlling those processes, and making sure there's a response to the audit that's timely. Actually, someone has had a chance to review before it ever goes to the regulator. Those are the different things that project lead is going to do for you. I'd say, as well as appointing a project lead, you've got to really think like an auditor. I've been doing this for a very long time, but even then, if you ask me to work for you, I don't know your organization. I don't know your day-to-day. Do I know regulatory functions and requirements? Yes, I do. Can I help you through an audit? Yes, I do. Yes, I can. But I don't know how you operate every day. And every organization does things slightly differently. You can't expect an auditor or an investigator to know your day-to-day activities. Even if you offer, let's pretend, compliance training. What compliance training do you provide? What's the content? How often do staff take that training? How do you monitor the staff take the training? And every organization does things differently. So it's your job to provide the context for how you operate on a day-to-day basis. Auditors expect to come in and they will first ask you for your policies and your procedures. That's the way that it goes. Very first thing. It's what I ask for. They'll look at your controls. They'll look at how you monitor compliance, how you monitor that people are following your policies and procedures. And they'll be looking to you to say, okay, well, you're a living, breathing organization. Of course, things can go wrong. So what mechanisms do you have in place to make sure that you know when something goes wrong and that you address them? So their role isn't to understand your business. They're not going to understand the minutiae of your business. But what they want to know is that within your business, you've got systems in place to understand where you have non-compliance and that you can address them. And I would think about that as pretty much a quality assurance program. Like, wouldn't you want to know if something's going wrong in your business? If you're hemorrhaging money somewhere, you would probably want to know about that, and you'd probably want to address it. Well, the same thing around compliance. And that's what you're trying to show. The worst scenario that you can have I mean, think about that. If you're thinking like an auditor and you're thinking about how to respond to an audit, what are the risks involved? I tell my clients and I tell, the teams I work with, have a sense of risk. How bad, what are the consequences if you're not compliant? What's going to happen? And have that in your head and use that as a bit of a guide. If you think that your evidence is a bit sloppy, but the penalty could be jail time, guess what? You need to do a bit of fine tuning and you can't submit sloppy evidence. You've got to really be on top of that. And your project lead has got to be on top of it. The next piece that I'd like to get into, so as you're thinking about a project lead and you're thinking about what's going through an auditor's mind, right? So you have that in the back of your head and you start to think, well, very carefully, what's your starting point, right? We talked a little bit about really understanding the scope of an audit and being very careful that you understand what you're being asked for, not more and not less. So when you get an audit request or you're being investigated, whether it's billing or marketing or security or risk adjustment or credentialing or any of the above, any of the experiences that almost all of us have been through, go through the actual requirements. Maybe it's a specific law like HIPAA. Maybe it's a set of regulations. Maybe they're accreditation standards. And parse out the exact requirements. Usually when you're notified about a particular audit, they tell you what you're going to be audited against. And if they don't spell it out, then maybe you need to do a little bit more homework and figure out and use your network as well. Has anyone else been audited? Or if you're being investigated, well, what are you being investigated for? If it's a false claim, then you need to go and have a really good look at the False Claims Act, federal and state, and understand what the requirements are and start thinking about how you're going to demonstrate compliance with those requirements. Now, what I do, just a hint and a tip, and we can provide this to you separately outside of this presentation as a bit of a takeaway, is I put the requirements into a table. I make sure that I know exactly what the requirements are, and I parse the requirements, whatever they might be, very carefully, because my goal is to be able to say, well, for each requirement, for every line in this law, or for every bit of this regulation, or these accreditation standards, I want to show evidence of compliance, or I want to be able to identify where we might have a gap. I want to understand that as I'm preparing to respond. Now, I'm not going to lie, it takes quite a bit of effort, and sometimes you might be short on time. It's worth the extra effort of going through this process, really understanding what the audit criteria is, and then what evidence you have or you don't have. And it's worth knowing that before you ever send any evidence out. All right, we also talked on a big issue, a big challenge that many of us have. And this, I guess, sits at the very heart why I do these presentations. Again, I've been doing this for 25 years. I've seen all kinds of evidence. And what I'd say to you is, when you're responding to an investigation or an audit, the worst thing you can do is throw together documentation, pieces of what you consider to be evidence, and submit them to the regulator. I'm going to come back to that conversation about the auditor knows nothing. They don't know your policies and procedures. They don't know anything about you. In most cases, the documentation you send them is really the first time they may have interacted with you. So I would tell you, first of all, label all of your documents. Tell that auditor what they're looking at. Describe all the documents. Provide context. What is this document? What does it show? Why does it matter? So when I submit evidence for an investigation and when I submit evidence for an audit, I rarely have anyone coming back to me and saying, oh, I have some additional questions. I've been asked a lot about that, but it's because for every criteria, I actually type up a little message, a little summary saying, actually, here's the audit criteria. Here's what you're looking at, auditor. And here's how this meets the audit criteria. Or there have been cases when I've identified, actually, we have an issue of non-compliance. So I say that. Here's where we have a gap. This is what we're doing about it. Please see document this, this, and this that shows you the corrective action that we're taking. So you're telling a story. You're telling the auditor, this is how we operate. This is how we're doing. This is what we're doing. Here's what you're looking at. It makes the biggest difference in the world. If you've ever audited, you know exactly what I mean. So I would say you follow a structured format. When you're providing evidence, here's our policy. Here's proof we followed the policy. And again, if you're not compliant, explain why you're not compliant and what it is you're doing about it. But I'd say context, context, and context. Tell that story. So just looking quickly at what could be strong documentation, because I really have seen everything. And I've taken over teams that were really struggling with their audit response and really getting slammed, if I can use, that word. So think about it. If the area that's being assessed is staff training, compliance training, first you're going to give a policy. Here's our policy on how we do compliance training. Okay, then the next question, what would the auditor want to see? The auditor wants to see that you're following that policy. Okay, auditor, here you go. Here's our LMS report, our learning management system report, showing that 98% of our staff have completed this year's training. Oh yeah, we do know that 2% of our staff have not taken the training, but here's why. Some of them were on maternity leave, some of them were, sick, whatever it is, some were on vacation. Here's how we're following up. Hotline monitoring, let's say that's what's being assessed. All right, well, is there a whistleblower policy? Okay, yeah, here you go, auditor, here's the whistleblower policy. Okay, well, auditor wants to know evidence that the policy is actually followed. So you might have a log of hotline calls and investigation reports and awareness campaign materials. This is all showing actually, yeah, we have a process in place. We have a written policy. Here you go. And here's evidence that we actually implement this policy. Here's how it works. Plus a little summary page to say, here's how it works at our organization. And then here's what you're looking at. You're looking at our policy, our hotline log, our investigation reports, and our awareness campaign materials, right? And I won't go through the other two examples, but you'll follow the very same process, right? And you're setting up a story for somebody that otherwise has no idea about your organization or how it works. So to give you some examples, right? An auditor asked for a summary of compliance training modules. I get this every time. The auditor wants to know what the compliance training actually covers. The auditor receives screenshots of a compliance presentation on privacy training. I have to tell you, for those of you who have been in my shoes, this doesn't tell me anything. So first of all, I got screenshots of a compliance presentation. Well, I don't know the date of that. I don't know who took the training. I don't know how it was implemented. I didn't get a policy. Like, that literally tells me nothing. And so isn't very helpful. Like, it doesn't demonstrate compliance. Question, another scenario. An auditor receives a conflict of interest policy and procedure along with an example of how a conflict of interest was managed. The auditor sees that the processes do not match. So again, that's poor evidence to give to an auditor. And there's no context. There's no context to say, hey, we had a new member of staff, or we're actually in the middle of changing the policy and the procedure. Like, there's nothing there for me. And the last scenario, just to give you one final example, is that the auditor asks for claims, but receives a robust claims audit report that shows there are findings. But there's no information about the findings. There's no information that those findings were addressed, right? So the auditor is thinking, great, there's a claims audit report that shows that this organization is auditing their claims, making sure that they're following the right processes, but there are findings and we have no idea whether they're actually addressing these findings. So some things to think about in terms of what is good evidence, what's not evidence, what demonstrates compliance and what does not. Right. Just so that you can have a look at later on, I've included a slide around just to dig a little bit deeper about what good documentation looks like for an audit or an investigation and what isn't so good. So I'll let you review that at your own leisure, but it's there and should give you a good steer about how you can possibly strengthen your own evidence.
Yep. And don't forget to drop your questions in the question box, and Jessica will answer all those at the end.
So you shouldn't be surprised at this point by this slide. So we're talking about telling the compliance story and why storytelling matters. By now, you've gotten the idea. It's about setting the scene and explaining to someone who knows nothing about you how compliance is structured within your organization. You're providing the context, and what you're really doing is that you're connecting your policies, your processes, and your evidence to the audit criteria. You're saying, hey, we know, we understand, this is specifically what you want to look at. Well, here's how we do it, and here's how we're compliant. And you want to translate that compliance for your auditors. Please don't assume they know everything. I don't know about you. I know actually that at least some of you have been in a situation where you're looking at your auditor and thinking to yourself, do you know anything? Like, do I really have to spell this out? They do know something, but you also, yes, you need to spell it out. They might not understand exactly how your processes work. That doesn't mean they don't know the regulations or the accreditation standards, but they don't necessarily know your operation. Anticipate questions. If something can be misunderstood, it will be misunderstood. So explain it up front, right? If you've had a change of staff, or if you're undergoing, I don't know, a restructuring, okay, explain that. That might explain why certain policies and procedures aren't working as expected or aren't being followed as expected. And be transparent. If there's an issue, if there's an incident of noncompliance, own it and explain what you're doing about it. There's nothing that builds more distrust with an auditor and investigator as when a provider or an individual or an organization tries to hide a particular issue or tries to make a case for compliance when they know very well they're not really compliant. And you don't want that. You want to build trust with whoever you're working with. I'd say structure the story. Present your evidence clearly, logically, organized. Use an index or a cover page if you have to. Label everything. Auditors don't know what they're looking at unless you explain it. Don't leave them guessing. Connect the dots for them. Provide a summary explaining how your evidence meets the compliance standard. Because if you don't provide that summary, they're going to come to their own conclusions, and they might not be the same as yours, and they might not be accurate. Anticipate questions. If something can be misunderstood, clarify. And also a tip, watch for any specific page labeling instructions and plan in advance. I don't know who's been audited or investigated by the Office for Civil Rights, but I worked for someone once that was, and they had very specific requirements about how they wanted pages to be labeled and evidence to be produced. And it was not an easy undertaking by any stretch. We talked about this a little bit already, so I won't go into too much detail. But like I said, if you see a risk in your evidence, you're planning, you're gathering the evidence, you're making sure that the evidence meets the scope of the audit criteria. If you find a risk or you find a gap, and explain how you're going to correct it. And as you're doing that, make sure that you explain this in the evidence and that you've given a timeline that you're expecting to be compliant by. Show how you're monitoring the issue. Show that maybe you've even done a risk assessment and you've got audit plans for the future. Do what you need to do to show the auditor and the investigator that you're not ignoring the issue. You've identified a problem. You're doing something about it. That's far more acceptable to an auditor, and they'll have more faith in you and more faith in your controls than if you show them evidence that suggests don't own your risks or your gaps. And I just got a little bit ahead of myself. So I'd say that a risk found by an auditor is a compliance failure. That's really what happens, right? If they find non-compliance, well, that's a compliance failure and results in a finding. But if you find that very same risk and you provide a corrective action, that's then seen as a strong compliance program. I know that because I've been the auditor, I've been the assessor, the surveyor in those shoes. I'd far rather deal with an organization that owns their non-compliance and says, we got this and we're fixing it, than the ones who never identified their compliance risk to begin with. And last but not least, we touched on this, very briefly. Prep your people. If you know you're going to have in-person interviews, bring in your stakeholders early. Those folks who are going to be interviewed need to understand the scope of the audit. They need to have some responses ready to go, and they need to feel comfortable speaking to an auditor. And also you want to make sure that those who are speaking with auditors and investigators are providing consistent, clear responses, that they understand the policies and procedures and the compliance culture around your organization. And that's what you want. You want your documentation and you want your people to demonstrate compliance. So definitely prep them. Some strategies: educate the staff on the purpose of the audit, cover key topics, conduct mock interviews, and reinforce the importance of clear and effective communication within that group and with whoever is auditing or investigating. Make sure that they understand not to give inconsistent answers between them. So you have 2 or 3 people being interviewed, maybe at the same time. Actually, their answers should be consistent with each other. You don't want your staff over-explaining or volunteering unnecessary information. You don't want them to speculate or guess while they're in front of the auditors or the interviewers. And you don't want them to be particularly anxious or defensive as they're being audited. Confidence can build credibility, so that goes a long way. So those are kind of my hints and tips for helping your staff. So quickly, before we get to the end, some key takeaways. Appoint a strong project lead if you're being audited or investigated. Understand exactly what's being audited. Gather and analyze your evidence. Analyze it. Have a look at it before you send it out. Think like an auditor and anticipate questions. Identify gaps if you can, and then own them. Use corrective action plans where you need them. Remember to tell the story of what an auditor should be looking at, and then prep your teams for your in-person interviews. All of this will go a long way to making that audit or that investigation run a lot more smoothly than otherwise. So if you'd like more information, please do get in touch. You can contact me directly at my email or through my website. I'm more than happy to answer questions or listen to your story.
Jessica, thank you so much. There was so much goodness packed into that presentation. Much appreciated. Don't forget, you can still continue dropping questions in the chat, and Jessica will answer those shortly. First, I would love to give you just a little bit of information about MedTrainer and how we can help you to simplify audit preparedness. First, wondering, would an auditor accept an FTCA-specific policy as an appropriate to cover any and all compliance-related issues?
Just found that microphone. I doubt it. I need to know a little bit more about your situation. I'm going to say no. The FTCA specific policy is a specific policy for a specific need. All compliance related issues, it couldn't possibly cover. I think we probably need to nail down that question a little bit more. There's no policy that can cover all compliance related issues. So maybe I need to understand a little bit more about the question, but I'm going to say for now, no.
Excellent. And then we've got a couple of questions that are specific to triple AHC compliance. Is that something that you're familiar with, Jessica? And do you help any of your clients with triple AHC surveys?
Yeah, I do. And I mean, so the first one is around credentialing. Well, credentialing pretty much from one survey to another, one accreditation method to another really doesn't change that much. And for nurses in California, pretty much the same kind of credentialing criteria is what you're going to find are needed. So if you'd like to talk about that further, I'm more than happy to have a conversation with you. What does credentialing look like? Well, are you excluded on the OIG, screening list, or do you have a criminal background? Do you have the qualifications for the role? And, do you have, any certain blood tests and the TB test and all that kind of stuff? So that doesn't vary too much from one state to the other or from one provider to the other, but I'm more than happy to talk to you about it if you have a specific concern.
So Jessica, thank you so very much. We really, really appreciate you sharing this information. Within the next 24 hours or so, you'll get an email that will have the recording as well as all of Jessica's slides with all of the goodness and information that she included. Jessica, thank you again. So much great information included there. And Frank, thank you for that. Within the next 24 hours or so, you'll receive an email that'll have the recording. And thank you again for joining us.